is over, and I tell my scribe this, the scribe will do the preliminary marks on the left-hand side. But after the test is over, then I, as a judge, will look over the marks. Say there's 3 or 4 preliminary marks. I will then determine the final score for the judge, which is that second column in. And then I will do the one at the bottom for rhythm elasticity. And then I flip it over and I will do the artistic and write further comments. So there's a lot of work to be done between tests. The freestyles are usually scheduled with at least 3 minutes before tests, sometimes 4 minutes. You need all of it. But tell the scribes, is it going to be, and some judges have the scribes do the math. And it's also useful for the scribes to know if they need to take note of something that was forbidden in error. As far as I'm concerned, I would tell them that in the heat of battle as the test is going on. I don't expect the scribe to do and make any of those decisions. Some judges do, however, and you will explain that to them before you start. It's your style to decide how you want to do that and who does what the scribe does and what you do. But as a general rule, I've had every scribe I've had that said, oh, I'm so scared, I've never done freestyles before. At the end of it, they go, oh, I really enjoyed that. That was easier than a regular test. Okay, next screen. Methodology. Okay. Methodology means, in this context, how the judge determines their score. So this is actually an equation. It's done in the regular test as well, but you do the same thing with freestyles. There are certain basics that have to be evaluated, and then the criteria for, so the basic for a walk would be, is it a 4-beat walk? Is it active? The criteria, did it cover 20 meters? And then plus and minus modifiers. Was the transition clear? And you end up at the score. Same thing on the artistic side. There are basic primary criterion, and then there are plus or minus modifiers equals the score. So some things are weighted much more heavily than others, and the judges who have any experience always know first what are the most important basics, and then whether or not the modifier is a big issue or not. So next screen. Now, we're going to flip on over to the artistic side. We've talked about the technical side. We've now turned the page over, and we're getting to the artistic side. There's only 5 boxes here, but this is where the almost most of the work occurs in a freestyle. So we have, there's 5 categories: harmony, choreography, degree of difficulty, music, and interpretation. And you'll notice harmony and degree of difficulty are fairly straightforward. And then the other 3 have listed criteria in the order of their importance. So those subcategories will be, the first thing listed is the primary criterion, and then its modifiers follow. So for example, for choreography, the design, cohesiveness of the design would be the primary criteria there. Then it might be modified by how well you use the entire arena and how balanced the creativity would be. Under music, is its music suitable to this course? Was the music cohesive? Was the editing seamless? And then under interpretation, and this to me is perhaps in a lot of ways to me the most important box on the back side. Does it clearly express the horse's gaits? Is the music appropriate to a trot, appropriate to a canter? Does the rider make use of the phrasing and dynamics of the music? If the music gets big, does the rider do a lengthening? If the music gets soft, is that the appropriate choice there for that movement? Okay, next screen. Before the test begins, now, test of choice classes drive me a little bit nuts because the tests can be in random order. So they're not just freestyles, which already raises the difficulty. They can also be in very random order. So, and that's because the computer identifies freestyles by the class number. They don't identify freestyles by what the level is. But you really need to check that over closely, anticipate the level of training for each test, recognize the difficulty, and make sure you know which are the legal movements so that if an illegal movement occurs, you're recognizing it quickly. You want to also, I think very important, recognize when something is more difficult when it's attempted. Now, degree of difficulty can include a lot of things. One of the things that I like to see in a freestyle, if I see a freestyle written, the choreography written to the dynamics of the music, if the music changes and the choreography changes, to me, that's not just artistically pleasing, it's also very difficult. So I will also chalk that up under degree of difficulty. But again, you also have to be aware under that same category if there are illegal movements or transitions. And sometimes when a writer is trying to increase a degree of difficulty, they do something that technically they're not allowed to do. So that's the last thing we have on the PowerPoint. This is, we've gone about 45 minutes, so that technically that's how long we're supposed to take for this. But yeah, I know you have a lot of questions. And so can we do some of the questions? And if people want to take a break while we do it, we'll then have a short break and do the second part.
Okay, so Margaret, first question. Can you talk a little more about how you judge, like how you determine a score when the riders do not perform the compulsory movements for the duration of the designated distance?
For starters, it would be insufficient. Then I have to decide how it's insufficient. So if they were supposed to do the shoulder in for 12 meters and they only did it for 8, they're not going to get a score that's above a 5 or a 5 or above. And if the walk, for example, is less than 20 meters, it's that's considered a 0. Now, you can, if something occurred, like the horse being disobedient, that caused those issues, you might not be quite so hard and fast with, say, a specific distance. There's so many different factors that might fall into that. Again, the key word is intentional. So if somebody's avoiding something that's been laid out under the movements, if it was intentionally omitted from the test, that's a 0. Otherwise, you can go higher than a 0, but if they didn't fulfill the criteria, then it's probably not going to be even a 5.
Okay, so along those same lines then, let's say that a flying change happens by mistake, but then the rider doesn't show a simple change when they're supposed to because the flying change happened by mistake. How do you score that?
We'd have to see it. What was the reason for the mistake? It might have been a counter-canter that got out of balance. But as I gave in the example, if you were supposed to do a simple change and the horse did a flying change, you need to get back on the correct lead and do, let me put it this way, you get a score for all those required things. So you have to show all the required things. Now, this is a bit of an issue with strategy. It's a really good idea, for example, to leave some space at the end of your 5 minutes where you have something that isn't specifically choreographed, so that if you made a mistake earlier, but you can't resolve it in such a way to keep going with your music, then you can go back at the end and do the required movement. so that you can get a score for that box. Does that make sense? Now, the FEI actually, they're doing this now by computer. They call that a joker line. You plan a joker line at the end of your test so that if you have a mistake with a required movement, you have a place where you can finally do it and get that score. But if you absolutely fill every space of your freestyle with your choreography and you don't allow for the opportunity to fix it, redo a compulsory movement, then it's probably not a great strategy. Does that help a little bit? You do have to do every required movement.
Okay, so then if, let's say you have a shoulder in and it starts out great, the initial quality is really good, starts out like an 8, but it's not the full length, again, right, how are you scoring?
The reason is, why wasn't it a full length? Was it intentional, or did the horse do something naughty? Now, it could be a really good one, but then the horse stumbles or the horse shies. If it was unintentional, I weight that as to the degree of how serious the thing was. But again, a shoulder in is required to be 12 meters. That's not that long. Remember, half the length of an arena is 30 meters. So that's not even a quarter of the length of the arena. But if something like that happens, the 12 meters doesn't happen, I try and factor in the reason why it didn't happen. Was it a planned mistake on the rider's part, in which case the degree of difficulty in the choreography go down as well? Or is it just a low score because the horse wasn't in on the plan and decided to do something else?
Okay. And then can you talk about where the preliminary marks go? And I'm going to try to go back in the slides.
Okay, well, if you can, but everybody, if you have a copy of the score sheet, the box on the left side of the technical execution, that at the top it says compulsory elements and preliminary marks. So the preliminary marks go in the same box where, here I am pointing at the one. The box on the far left where the numbers says medium walk, for example, there's a space there. The preliminary marks go there because there could be more than one. And then the judge will mentally decide what the final mark will be and then put it in the judge's mark. But the preliminary marks go in that column that says preliminary marks.
Oh, there it is.
Okay.
And not all the scribes recognize that. You have to point it out.
Do you have any trouble like fitting it in? Do scribes have trouble fitting it in? Or?
There is a famous story of a friend of mine who had a new scribe, and apparently the discussion wasn't clear enough. And it turned out the scribe, there was more like 4 marks for this one box, and say it was flying change and there was 4 of them. She gave the number for the second one, and she said flying change, and then said it again because it was the second flying change. The scribe erased the number from the first one. And then when she got to the 4th one, she told the judge to make up their mind. So you can't assume anything. But no, I think that there's enough room. You can go out in margin if you have to.
Okay. Why don't we take one more question and then maybe take a really quick break?
Okay.
So last question for right now is judging a regular test versus judging a freestyle. Do you judge like a spook or a stumble any differently in a regular test versus in a freestyle?
No. And a lot of it comes back to how quickly the situation can be resolved and what caused it. And the same rule applies in the freestyle, by the way, as it does in a regular test. If there is an outside disturbance, say a deer decides to run through the ring, or there's a loose horse running around, the judge can stop it so that doesn't affect your ride. And the judge should stop it. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. But the music's playing. I think a disobedience is a disobedience, or an issue is an issue. And so no, that part of it, the technical side I find very straightforward. The only part of the technical side that scares me is, and I use the word scares me, is if I get to the bottom and my scribe says we don't have a box for the shoulder into the right. That makes my blood run cold. You know, and then I have to think back, did they do a shoulder into the right? Okay, so quick break and then we'll start on the second section.
Yep, we're gonna say like 2, 3, 4 minutes. Everyone can stretch their legs and then come right back, okay?
I'm gonna stand up and move around. So second screen. Now you should know that the front side of the test and the back side of the test are both equally weighted, 50% each of the score. If there's a tie, the tie will be broken by the artistic impression. The scores given on the technical side are either whole points or half points, but on the artistic side, the judges can use tenths like 0.1, 0.2, and there are larger coefficients. So that will help refine the artistic differences. The coefficients will highlight, screen 3. The coefficients highlight each category's weight. Now, under harmony at training level, degree of difficulty is the least. And it goes up for first through fourth, but it's still not as significant as the other categories. And I have seen many riders who feel like they have to boost that degree of difficulty score, and in doing so, they end up perhaps overemphasizing that and make mistakes in choreography and interpretation. So don't consider degree of difficulty first. That's the least of the coefficients. Okay, next screen. Each category is done slightly differently. Harmony is more straightforward, but when we are doing all of these categories, we are following that equation of the criteria plus or minus the modifiers. Next screen, please. Harmony is the easiest one. It reflects the overall technical execution of the test. I like what they have here on the left-hand side, the qualities of harmony. I especially like the line trust between horse and rider. And very often when that music starts playing and it's not a straightforward test, sometimes you see the horse, very often, not sometimes, see the horse lose confidence, they lose their comfort level, they lose their calmness, and it just all goes out the window. And generally, for both the horse and the rider, freestyles create greater challenges. I like to say that a freestyle is the equivalent of the fourth tested level. So a fourth level freestyle is like fourth level test 4. A second level freestyle is like second level test 4. In other words, you should be able to conquer the highest requirements of a level before you take on a freestyle. Next screen. This should give you a little bit of an idea for the judges there of how to determine harmony. So 6.5 to 7.4 satisfactory, very few minor tension issues. Above 7.5 and higher, horse shows confidence, and 8.5 and higher, it's all those good things, a true partnership. Next screen. Okay, choreography. The coefficient is 4. Design cohesiveness is the primary criterion. By that, we mean there's understandable lines, the movements are recognizable, the transition makes sense. Now, do not, as if you're a rider or a trainer or a judge, do not expect that transitions occur at letters. They can occur any place. Just because there's a letter there doesn't mean that's where you have to do the transition. The transition should go more with the music than it does with the letter. So don't worry about the letters so much. When the choreography is clear and understandable, you should give it at least a 7. And you would lower it if the pattern is confusing or a movement is just doesn't have clarity, it's poorly performed, or it's not doing those 12 meters that we talked about. If disruptions make it hard for us to tell what the intent of the rider was. And if you include a forbidden movement above the level, that means the choreography score can be no higher than a 5.5. So that's, again, a double hit on your score. Next screen, please. Okay. Once the clarity of the choreography is determined, you can modify that by going up and down. Are all the areas in the arena included? Are the movements distributed around the ring, not just in one area? Is there a fairly equal use of right and left? Okay, next screen. In choreography, creativity is an important modifier. Combinations should be perhaps in different locations than normal for a standard test. Different lines, say as short diagonals, doing things on the quarter line, say, for example, a shoulder run on the center line might be interesting. An interesting change of direction. Combinations that aren't in the current tests. Now, if you do long lines where nothing happens, that's not very interesting. And if you somehow manage, if the rider somehow manages to get some interesting element surprise that they pull off nicely, then give them credit for that under choreography. Next screen. Again, now when choreography is clear and understandable, start with a base of 7. Modify by use of the rein and the balance. Were the patterns test-like or more creative? I will say that it's almost impossible to do an entire freestyle without some part of it looking like something that came from the test. The whole thing can't be creative. And I think it's a mistake to say, oh, gee, as a judge, oh, test-like, if some part of it is recognizable from the test, just as long as they show some other interesting things. But it's pretty hard to come up with an entire freestyle that doesn't have some moment that resembles a test. Okay, next screen. Now, under degree of difficulty, remember that to qualify to ride a freestyle now in a USCF freestyle, you have to qualify with a 63%. So we expect an execution on the technical side of at least 63%. And that then also helps us determine the degree of difficulty. If you're a phrase I use over and over again, and it comes from the FEI test. It doesn't show up on our test, but it's from the FEI test, and I use it a lot, is the concept under, when we're determining degree of difficulty, well calculated risk. Did you try something hard and pull it off? Or did you try something hard and mess it up? And so if you tried something hard and messed it up, and now your overall technical side is below a 63, your degree of difficulty score is going to go down as well. But you expect at least that level of performance in the technical aspects. Okay, next box. Now, if the performance exceeds the expectation for the level, go ahead and go up in your difficulty. And it needs to exceed the expectation at both the trot and canter. I've seen great freestyles that had lovely trot portions, and then the canter just went to heck. The degree of difficulty goes down. It's got to be for more than just trot and canter. And every once in a while I see something cool at the walk, but that doesn't happen very often. I try mostly at the walk to just look for the quality of the actual walk. Next box. Next PowerPoint. Yay. Okay. If the technical execution is at least a 63 or higher, then your minimum score under degree of difficulty should probably be a 7. If they put together patterns that are still at the level but have increased the degree of difficulty, then you should go up to an 8. If their quality on the technical is a 66.5, I'm going to have to think that over as to whether or not it affects the degree of difficulty. If it's less than a 6 type on the left on the technical, then that definitely lowers the degree of difficulty, and it could also reduce the score for harmony, and should reduce the score for harmony. Okay, next. Recognize the degree of difficulty. For example, this is a list at training level. The training level requires a serpentine, but if you do shallow loops, like 50-meter loops, that would increase the difficulty. It can't be less than a 50-meter loop, but if you do 15-meter loops rather than 20-meter loops, then that would increase the degree of difficulty. A 4-loop serpentine would increase the degree of difficulty. Your loops can't be smaller than 15 meters, however, but 15-meter loops would help the degree of difficulty. And the loops must be continuous. And then next screen. Here's some examples at first level. A leg yield zigzag would increase the degree of difficulty. Doing figures and transitions on the center line or the quarter line. A challenging combination of movements. A canter serpentine with 20-meter loops would definitely increase the degree of difficulty at first level. Okay, second level. You could have a combination of lateral movements. An example that's from the test would be a shoulder in circle, haunches in. If you go from shoulder in to haunches in, that raises the degree of difficulty. Doing lateral movements on the quarter line, for example, or going medium canter directly to counter canter, which is harder than it sounds. And this one, I think, can be very effective counter canter to a simple change to counter canter. That's a good example of a degree of difficulty movement that would raise your score there. Okay, next box. Again, what was the overall score on the technical side? At least 63%. Were the movements performed at the top test indicative of the top test to that level? Was more difficulty attempted? If so, were they successful? Was it shown at both gates? And if they include movements from above the level, again, your degree of difficulty score comes down, as does your choreography score. Okay, next screen. Okay, now there is a lovely tab on the USDF website that has a great detail assessing degree of difficulty by level. It's a big help both for riders and for judges. And then also there is that goes into great detail. And if you also look at the test sheet itself, it'll tell you movements that are above the level, so you don't want to do those. But ways of combining movements to increase the degree of legal movements to increase the difficulty is a good approach to take. And that tab on the USDF website will help you out. Okay, next screen.
Turn it off.
Okay, so here is a choreography pattern.
Turn it off.
We're going to look at this for degree of difficulty. This is from a training level freestyle. You halt, you turn right at C, you now do a 20-meter circle at R, and then you do a free walk across the shoulder, the short diagonal. You do a half circle at walk and then a medium walk, and you notice they keep on going because otherwise it wouldn't have been the 20 meters. Now they pick up the trot. That's a bit of a tougher location. 20-meter circle to the right, then a 3-loop serpentine, and then coming back across the diagonal into a circle. Are the patterns clear? Yes. So under choreography, for example, that would be at least a 7, or in your mind. That's one of the questions you're going to ask. Was the arena used in its entirety? Perhaps. A little bit too much was squished down at C, so that might modify it a little bit. Were all the transitions legal? Absolutely. An interesting walk pattern, which would raise the degree of difficulty and also perhaps raise your choreography score. The serpentine met the degree of difficulty for the top test at the level. They could have done that serpentine in a more shallow loop, like 15 meters, and then it would have gone up for difficulty. Now, if they are going to do the stretch circle, which I think is required at tri level, is it hard? Is there a harder place in the arena than another place? Is it harder at A, harder at B and E, harder at C? How did it combine with other movements? That might be something that will affect the stretch circle movement. Next box. Second level pattern. Shoulder in on the center line to a 10-meter circle to a travers. It's on the center line, which increases the degree of difficulty to a certain extent, but they didn't go directly from shoulder into travers. They threw in that 10-meter circle, and that makes it a little bit easier, so I would not reward that at a degree of difficulty. I also might give a little bit of a knock to choreography because that's a test-like pattern that happens in the second level, very typical. So the question would be, would you go up on the choreography score, for example, if you took that circle out? I probably would. It depends on how well it's timed with the music. If it's timed with the music, then that would be fabulous. Okay, I think we are done with the required stuff I'm supposed to talk about. So let's go on to questions, and then we will watch a freestyle with freestyle. Or we can watch the freestyle with freestyle and then go to the question.
Let's take like 1 or 2 questions first.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question. How would you judge getting behind the music? And how would you judge a rider who like tries to stay with the music but then has to cut a movement short?
Well, if they cut the movement short and it's a required movement, that's a huge thing. You have to do every one of the required movements.